The year is 1888. Society pages are filled with news of the wedding of the season. Lady Seraphina Covington, a celebrated beauty whose family name is far richer than their coffers, is to marry the most enigmatic and desired man in England, Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood. He is a man carved from marble and shadow, possessing a fortune so vast it could rival the crown's. Every debutante dreamed of becoming his Duchess. But as the doors to the bridal chamber closed on their wedding night, the dream turned into a chilling nightmare. He didn't touch her. He didn't even look at her. Instead, he spoke 4 words that would shatter her world. "You'll sleep here, alone." The wedding was a masterpiece of social theatre. St. George's Chapel was a constellation of London's elite, every pew occupied by a lord, lady, or baroness, craning their necks to witness the union of the decade. Lady Seraphina Covington, her flame-red hair, a stark, beautiful contrast to the ivory Alençon lace of her gown, glided down the aisle on her father's arm. Her smile was practiced, a gentle curve of her lips that betrayed none of the desperate hope churning in her stomach. Marrying for a title was one thing. Marrying to save one's family from ruin was another entirely. The Covingtons were drowning in debt, and this marriage was their only life raft. At the altar stood Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood. He was impossibly handsome, with eyes the colour of a stormy sea, and a jaw so sharp it seemed capable of cutting glass. A hushed reverence fell over the congregation as he turned to watch her approach. He was a man of immense power and wealth, but also of profound mystery. He had inherited his title 5 years prior, after the tragic death of his father, and had remained a recluse in his sprawling northern estate, Blackwood Manor, emerging only for the most necessary of occasions. His sudden proposal to Seraphina had sent shockwaves through the aristocracy. Why her? Why now? Seraphina reached the altar, her hand trembling as she placed it in his. His skin was cool to the touch, his grip firm but impersonal. As they recited their vows, his voice was a low, steady baritone that resonated through the chapel. Yet his eyes remained distant, unreadable. He looked at her as one might look at a business partner with whom a contract was being signed. There was no flicker of affection, no hint of the tenderness a groom should show his bride. Still, Seraphina held on to a sliver of hope. Perhaps he was merely a private man, shy of public displays. Perhaps behind the cold facade was a heart waiting to be won. The reception at the Savoy was an opulent affair, a river of champagne flowing amidst mountains of caviar and tiered cakes. Seraphina played her part to perfection, laughing at the jests of elderly lords and accepting the hollow congratulations of women whose eyes glittered with envy. Alistair remained by her side, a silent, imposing figure. He was polite, attentive even, but it was the attentiveness of a guardian, not a husband. He ensured her glass was filled and her plate was not empty, but he never truly met her gaze. As the night drew to a close, they departed in his private carriage, the Blackwood crest emblazoned on the door in stark silver. The journey to his London townhouse was undertaken in complete silence. The city lights blurred past the window as Seraphina sat opposite her new husband, the grand chasm between them feeling wider than the Thames. She studied his profile in the flickering gaslight, the severe line of his nose, the unyielding set of his mouth. Who was this man she had bound her life to? Finally they arrived. Servants scurried to take their cloaks and bags. The butler, a grim-faced man named Jennings, informed them that her Grace's chambers were prepared. Alistair simply nodded. He led the way up the grand, curving staircase, his footsteps echoing on the marble. Seraphina followed, the train of her heavy satin gown whispering behind her. He opened the door to a breathtaking suite of rooms, decorated in shades of cream and gold. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over a magnificent four-poster bed, its sheets turned down invitingly. Her lady's maid was nowhere in sight. They had been left alone for the first time. This was it. The moment her life would truly begin. Seraphina's heart hammered against her ribs. She turned to him, her expression a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. "It's a beautiful room," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Alistair stood by the door, his hand still on the brass knob. He did not step further into the room. He finally looked at her, his stormy eyes holding hers for the first time that day, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the late autumn air. There was no passion in his gaze, no desire. There was only a profound, bottomless indifference, as cold and hard as a tombstone. "You will have everything you require," he stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The staff has been instructed to see to your every need. Your duties as Duchess are simple. You will manage this household, and in time, you will provide me with an heir. That is the extent of our arrangement." Seraphina felt the blood drain from her face. "Arrangement?" "Indeed," he continued, as if discussing the purchase of livestock. "You will want for nothing in terms of material comfort, but do not mistake this for a marriage of affection. I require a duchess, not a wife." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her once, dismissively, before he concluded with the words that would become the bars of her gilded cage. "You'll sleep here. Alone." Without another word, he pulled the door closed, the soft click of the latch echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. Seraphina stood frozen, the warmth from the fireplace unable to reach the ice that had just encased her heart. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, the most envied woman in England, and she was utterly, devastatingly alone. The wedding night she had dreamed of, hoped for, and feared had ended before it had even begun. The first weeks of Seraphina's marriage were a study in opulent solitude. She lived in the Duke's London townhouse, a magnificent prison where the staff moved like ghosts, their expressions carefully blank. Alistair was true to his word. He did not share her bed. He barely shared the same air. They saw each other only at dinner, a torturous affair conducted in near-complete silence at opposite ends of a ridiculously long mahogany table. He would inquire about her day with the same detached interest he might ask a gardener about the state of the roses. He spoke of politics, of investments, of his trips to the city, but never of anything personal. He never asked how she felt. He never called her by her name. He simply referred to her as Madam. After 2 weeks of this cold pantomime, he announced his departure for Blackwood Manor, his ancestral seat in Northumberland. "You will follow in a week's time," he informed her over dessert. "Jennings will arrange your travel. The country air will be beneficial." It was not an invitation. It was an order. When Seraphina arrived at Blackwood Manor, she finally understood the source of her husband's disposition. The estate was as beautiful and forbidding as the man himself. It was a sprawling Gothic masterpiece of grey stone and towering turrets, set against a backdrop of wind-swept moors and dramatic, cloudy skies. It was magnificent, but it was not welcoming. It seemed to brood, soaking in the melancholy of the northern landscape. The household staff was overseen by a housekeeper named Mrs. Gable, a woman who seemed as ancient and unyielding as the manor's stone walls. Her grey hair was pulled into a severe bun, and her black dress was so stiff it looked as though it could stand on its own. From the moment Seraphina stepped over the threshold, she was met with a gaze of thinly veiled hostility. Mrs. Gable and the senior staff were fiercely loyal to the Duke, and they viewed Seraphina not as the new lady of the house, but as an unwelcome intruder. Seraphina's lady's maid, a young, nervous girl from her home village named Ilara, was her only ally. "They whisper, Your Grace," Ilara confessed one evening while brushing Seraphina's long hair. They say the Duke's heart was already given away." "To whom?" Seraphina asked, her voice betraying more hurt than she intended. Ilara hesitated. "To a Lady Genevieve Darlington, the daughter of the Earl of Ashworth. Everyone in society thought they were to be married. They say he's known her since they were children." The name struck Seraphina like a physical blow. Lady Genevieve Darlington. She was renowned for her classic blonde beauty and sharp wit. Seraphina had seen her at balls and social events, always surrounded by a coterie of admirers. The thought of Alistair with Genevieve, laughing, talking, perhaps even loving, sent a shard of jealousy through her, so sharp and painful it took her breath away. It explained everything. The coldness, the distance, the sham of their marriage. He had married Seraphina for duty, for an heir, while his heart remained with another. Determined not to be defeated by gossip and disapproving staff, Seraphina threw herself into learning her duties. She requested the household ledgers from Mrs. Gable, who relinquished them with the sour expression of someone surrendering a fortress. Seraphina spent days in the manor's vast library, poring over the accounts, discovering areas of waste and inefficiency that had gone unnoticed for years. She was intelligent and capable, and despite her gentle upbringing, she possessed a core of steel. She would not be a ghost in this house. She was its Duchess, and she would act the part, even if her husband refused to acknowledge her as his wife. One afternoon, while exploring the East Wing, she came upon a corridor that was covered in dust sheets. The air was still and heavy. At the very end was a set of carved oak doors, locked tight. When she asked Mrs. Gable about it, the housekeeper's face closed off completely. "The Duke ordered that wing sealed years ago, Your Grace," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "It is not to be entered." The mystery of the locked wing only deepened Seraphina's sense of unease. Blackwood Manor was a house of secrets, and she was living in the heart of them, married to a man who was the biggest secret of all. Alistair remained as distant in the country as he had been in London. He spent his days riding out on the moors or locked away in his study. He treated her with the same chilling courtesy, a performance for the staff that did nothing to warm the Arctic expanse between them. She was his Duchess in name, a prisoner in spirit, rattling around a gilded cage filled with the echoes of a love that was not hers. Months bled into one another, turning the green of late summer into the burnished gold of autumn. Seraphina slowly, painstakingly, began to carve out a place for herself at Blackwood Manor. She reorganized the kitchens, negotiated better prices with local merchants, and started a small school for the tenants' children on the estate. Her quiet competence and genuine kindness began to thaw the icy demeanor of the younger staff, who started to greet her with smiles instead of guarded expressions. Even Mrs. Gable's hostility seemed to temper into a grudging respect, especially after Seraphina identified a long-running theft from the wine cellar that the housekeeper had missed. Alistair observed these changes from a distance, his expression unreadable. He made no comment on her efforts, offering neither praise nor criticism. Their life together remained a hollow routine of silent dinners and separate wings. Seraphina had almost resigned herself to this lonely existence when a letter arrived, bearing the elegant crest of the Earl of Ashworth. A few days later, a carriage crunched up the gravel drive, and from it emerged the woman from the whispers, Lady Genevieve Darlington, She was even more beautiful up close. Her hair was the color of spun gold, and her eyes were a piercing, intelligent blue. She greeted Seraphina on the grand steps of the manor, with a smile that was dazzlingly bright, but didn't quite reach her eyes. "Your Grace," Genevieve said, her voice like honeyed silk. How wonderful to finally meet the woman who captured our elusive duke. I am an old, dear friend of Alistair's. I was visiting my aunt nearby and simply had to call. Her visit, Seraphina knew instinctively, was no coincidence. It was a reconnaissance mission. Over tea in the grand drawing room, Genevieve launched a subtle but relentless interrogation, her questions disguised as polite chatter. "This old house can be so terribly dreary, can't it? I do hope you're not dreadfully lonely," she began, her eyes scanning Seraphina's face for any sign of weakness. "I find I am quite occupied with my duties," Seraphina replied calmly, pouring the tea with a steady hand. "Ah, yes, your duties," Genevieve mused, a faint, condescending smile playing on her lips. "Alistair has always been so very dedicated to duty. It is his one true passion. I imagine he is a considerate husband." The question hung in the air, sharp and pointed. Seraphina met her gaze directly. "The Duke is everything a husband should be." It was a lie, but it was a necessary one. Admitting the truth of her sham marriage to this woman would be an unbearable humiliation. Genevieve's smile tightened fractionally. She had expected a tearful confession, not poised defiance. She changed tactics, her voice dropping into a tone of false intimacy. "You know, Alistair and I grew up together. We were inseparable. I understand him in a way few people can. He carries such deep sorrows. One has to be very patient with him." She was positioning herself as the expert, the one who held the key to the Duke's heart, and Seraphina as the naive newcomer. The visit stretched on for 3 days, an excruciating performance of social graces. Genevieve toured the house, offering backhanded compliments on Seraphina's changes. "How clever of you to find a use for that old linen. It must be a comfort to feel useful." She would reminisce constantly about her shared past with Alistair, peppering her stories with inside jokes and memories Seraphina could never be a part of. She was marking her territory, trying to make Seraphina feel like an outsider in her own home. The climax of her visit came on the final evening. Alistair had joined them for dinner, an unusual occurrence. He was, if possible, even more withdrawn in Genevieve's presence. Genevieve, however, blossomed, directing all her conversation and dazzling smiles at him, effectively rendering Seraphina invisible. "Do you remember, Alistair?" she said, placing a delicate hand on his arm. "That summer we spent by the lake? You promised you would build me a castle there one day." Alistair stiffened at her touch, his expression hardening. He gently removed his arm from her grasp. "We were children, Genevieve. Childhood fantasies rarely survive into adulthood." The rejection, though subtle, was clear. A flash of anger crossed Genevieve's face before she masked it with a light laugh. But the damage was done. The tension at the table was thick enough to cut with a knife. The next morning, as Genevieve was preparing to depart, she found Seraphina alone in the rose garden. The pretense of friendship was gone. "He may have married you," Genevieve said, her voice dripping with venom, "but he did it for the title and an heir. His heart will always be mine. You are nothing but a vessel, a placeholder. Once you give him a son, he will have no more use for you. Remember that." With that parting shot, she swept away, leaving Seraphina standing among the thorns. Genevieve's words were cruel, designed to wound, but they only served to harden Seraphina's resolve. She would not be a placeholder. She was the Duchess of Blackwood. This was her home, and she would not be driven from it by the ghost of a past love. She would find a way to breach the fortress around her husband's heart, or she would build a life of her own within its walls. Genevieve's visit, intended to destabilize Seraphina, had the opposite effect. It ignited a spark of defiance within her. She was tired of the whispers, the cold shoulders, the silent dinners. She was tired of being a beautifully dressed piece of furniture in her own home. Her husband had married her for a reason, however cold, and she was determined to understand it. Alistair, for his part, seemed to sink even deeper into his brooding silence after Genevieve's departure. It was as if her presence had stirred up a past he desperately wanted to keep buried. He became more reclusive than ever, often taking his meals in his study and riding out for hours on end, returning long after dusk, his face etched with a fatigue that seemed more emotional than physical. One stormy night, the wind howling around the eaves of the manor like a hungry wolf, Seraphina couldn't sleep. She wandered the dark, silent corridors, a single candle lighting her way. The house groaned around her, and she felt an overwhelming sense of loneliness. Drawn by a sliver of light from under the library door, she found her husband inside. He wasn't reading. He was standing by the fireplace, his back to her, staring into the flames. In his hand, he held a small, silver-backed locket, turning it over and over in his fingers. His broad shoulders were slumped, and for the first time, Seraphina saw not the cold, unapproachable Duke, but a man burdened by an immense, invisible weight. A wave of empathy, unexpected and powerful, washed over her. She took a tentative step into the room. "Alistair," she said softly, using his given name for the first time. He started, his head snapping up. He quickly pocketed the locket, his mask of indifference slamming back into place. But she had seen it, the raw, unguarded grief in his eyes before he'd had time to hide it. "You should be in bed," he said, his voice rough. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, moving closer. "Neither could you, it seems." He turned away, staring back into the fire. "I have matters on my mind." "Business?" she prodded gently. "Yes, business." The word was clipped, a clear dismissal, but Seraphina would not be dismissed tonight. She had seen the crack in his marble facade, and she had to know what was underneath. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "Why did you marry me?" He was silent for a long moment, the only sounds the crackling fire and the howling wind. "I told you. I require an heir." "Any presentable woman from a good family could have given you an heir," she countered, her courage growing. "Why me? Why did you choose me, only to treat me as if my very presence is an insult to you? You hide in your study, you barely speak a word to me. You leave me to face the condescension of your friends and the hostility of your staff. You made me your Duchess, but you deny me the slightest courtesy of a husband. I deserve to know why." Her words hung in the air, filled with the pent-up frustration and hurt of the past months. She expected him to be angry, to order her from the room. Instead, he let out a long, shuddering breath. He turned to face her, his eyes dark with a pain so profound it stunned her into silence. "You want to know why?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "Because you were suitable. Your lineage is impeccable, your reputation is spotless, and your family needed the money, which ensured you would accept. It was a transaction, nothing more. I chose you precisely because I felt nothing for you. Affection is a luxury I cannot afford, and a complication I do not want." The clinical cruelty of his words was breathtaking. "So your heart does belong to Lady Genevieve," she whispered, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped his lips. "Genevieve, this has nothing to do with her. She understands nothing. Before she could ask more, he stalked past her, stopping at the door. You have your title, your comfort, your security. That is the bargain you made. Do not ask for more. My life, my real life, is not and will never be your concern. He left, closing the door firmly behind him, leaving Seraphina alone in the firelight. His confession had answered nothing and everything. It wasn't Genevieve. It was something else, something deeper and more painful. He wasn't pushing her away out of love for another. He was pushing her away out of a deep-seated fear of affection itself. The silver locket, the locked wing, the profound sadness she'd seen in his eyes. They were all pieces of a puzzle she was now more determined than ever to solve. He had warned her not to ask for more, but for the first time, Seraphina felt she was fighting, not just for her marriage, but for the soul of the broken man who was her husband. Alistair's harsh words in the library, meant to end her inquiries, only fueled Seraphina's resolve. His denial of Genevieve, as the reason for his coldness, meant the truth lay elsewhere, hidden within the walls of Blackwood Manor. Her mind kept returning to the locked doors in the east wing. Whatever secret Alistair guarded so fiercely, she felt certain the answer was behind them. She needed a key. Bribery or force would be met with immediate reporting to the Duke. She needed an ally. Her gaze fell upon her timid maid, Ilara, who, despite her fear of the other staff, had grown fiercely loyal to Seraphina. One evening, Seraphina confided a part of her plan to the young maid. Ilara, I need to know what is in the east wing. It's important for me to understand the Duke. Ilara's eyes widened in fear. But your Grace, Mrs. Gable said. I know what she said, Seraphina interrupted gently. But Mrs. Gable is not the one who has to live a life of silence with a husband she doesn't understand. I'm not asking you to steal a key. But you hear the gossip, the stories the older staff tell. Has anyone ever spoken of that wing? This new approach worked. A few days later, a trembling Ilara came to her. They don't talk about it much, Your Grace. But I heard one of the stable hands talking about the Duchess's keys. He said the old Duchess, that is the Duke's mother, had a master set of keys for every room in the manor, even the ones the late Duke kept private. After she passed, Mrs. Gable locked them away in her office. The housekeeper's office was a small, severe room off the main hall, and Mrs. Gable guarded it like a dragon. But Seraphina knew the housekeeper took a long walk around the grounds every afternoon at 3 o'clock, a habit as regular as clockwork. The next day, with her heart pounding, Seraphina waited until the clock struck 3. With Ilara standing as a nervous watch, she slipped into the office. It was meticulously tidy. On the wall hung a large board with dozens of labelled keys. Tucked away in a drawer of the main desk, inside a velvet-lined box, she found it. A heavy, ornate iron ring holding about a dozen brass keys, none of them labelled. The Duchess's keys. Taking the ring, she hurried towards the east wing, her silk skirts rustling in the tomb-like silence. She found the imposing oak doors and, after several tense attempts, one of the brass keys turned in the lock. The door swung open with a low groan, releasing a gust of stale, cold air. The wing was not merely dusty, it was preserved. The furniture was covered in white dust sheets, creating an eerie landscape of ghostly shapes. But this was no shrine to Genevieve Darlington. As Seraphina pushed deeper into the wing, she uncovered a suite of rooms that were distinctly feminine, decorated in soft blues and pale yellows. On a vanity table, a silver-backed brush lay next to a crystal perfume bottle, as if its owner had just stepped out. In the main sitting room, a large portrait hung above the fireplace, covered by a sheet. With trembling hands, Seraphina pulled it down. The woman who stared back at her was not Genevieve. She was breathtakingly beautiful, with warm, smiling brown eyes and dark chestnut hair piled high on her head. At the bottom of the canvas, a small brass plaque read, Eleonora, Duchess of Blackwood, 1882. Alistair had been married before. The realization hit Seraphina with the force of a physical blow. No one had ever spoken of it. There was no mention of a first wife in any of the society pages she had read. It was a secret that had been utterly erased. Moving as if in a dream, she opened the door to the adjoining room. It was a nursery. A beautifully carved cradle stood in the corner, a small mobile of wooden birds hanging over it, frozen in mid-flight. Everything was pristine, waiting for an occupant who had never arrived. On a small writing desk near the window, she found what she was looking for. A leather-bound diary. The elegant script inside belonged to Eleonora. Seraphina sank into a nearby chair and began to read. The diary started with entries full of joy and love. She wrote of her deep, passionate love for her husband, Alistair, and his for her. He was not the cold, distant man Seraphina knew, but a man who laughed, who brought her wildflowers from the moors, who read poetry to her by the fire. Then, the entries chronicled her pregnancy. Her excitement was palpable, her love for her unborn child pouring onto the page. The final entry was dated 5 years ago. October 12th. The pains have started. Alistair is frantic, but I have never been calmer. I will soon hold our son, Thomas, in my arms. My darling Alistair will be a father. My life is complete. There were no more entries. Suddenly, a sharp gasp came from the doorway. Seraphina looked up to see Mrs. Gable standing there, her face as white as a sheet. Ilara cowered behind her. For a moment, Seraphina expected an explosion of fury, but Mrs. Gable's harsh facade crumbled, and her eyes filled with a profound, gut-wrenching sorrow. She died, the housekeeper whispered, her voice cracking. The birth was difficult. We lost them both. The Duchess and the baby. She looked at the portrait of Eleonora, her expression one of utter devotion. He was never the same after. He locked this wing. He locked his heart. He ordered that her name never be spoken again. He buried her, and he buried himself along with her. At last, Seraphina understood. The crushing weight of grief, the locket, the fear of affection. He hadn't married her because his heart belonged to another living woman. He had married her because his heart was buried in a grave with his first wife and child. He hadn't chosen her because he felt nothing. He had chosen her because feeling anything at all was a pain he could not bear to face again. The discovery in the East Wing changed everything for Seraphina. The anger and resentment she had harbored towards Alistair evaporated, replaced by a deep and aching empathy. She now saw the man beneath the cold exterior, a man so shattered by grief that he had built a fortress of indifference around himself to survive. She returned the Duchess's keys to Mrs. Gable's office before they were missed, and a silent understanding passed between her and the stern housekeeper. Mrs. Gable's hostility toward Seraphina softened into something akin to compassion. She began to leave a fresh pot of Seraphina's favorite tea in the drawing room in the afternoons, and would offer quiet observations about the running of the estate, treating her, for the first time, as its true mistress. Seraphina made a crucial decision. She would not confront Alistair with her knowledge. To do so would be to rip open a wound he had spent 5 years trying to seal. An accusation would only make him retreat further. Instead, she began to speak a new language with him, the language of silence and quiet support. She stopped trying to force conversations at dinner. Instead, she created a peaceful space. She would talk gently about the estate, the progress of the tenant school, a new foal born in the stables, the success of the apple harvest, topics that were neutral, that concerned the legacy he was responsible for, but did not touch upon the personal. She asked for nothing, demanded nothing. Alistair was, at first, suspicious of the change. He watched her across the dinner table, his eyes narrowed, waiting for the inevitable demand or emotional outburst. But it never came. Day after day, she was simply there, a calm, steady presence. He slowly began to uncoil. He started to respond to her gentle reports, offering his own opinions on estate matters. The silences between them were no longer fraught with tension, but comfortable, companionable. A turning point came during a violent autumn storm that swept across the moors. A bolt of lightning struck one of the ancient oaks on the property, and it crashed down onto the roof of the main tenant farmer's cottage, trapping the family inside. Word reached the manor in the middle of the night. Alistair was instantly in command, organizing the stable hands and groundsmen. To his surprise, Seraphina appeared in the hall, dressed not in a flimsy nightgown, but in a practical woolen skirt and heavy cloak, her hair tied back. "I'm coming with you," she stated simply. "I've had some training in nursing. I can help." He started to object, but something in her determined expression stopped him. He gave a curt nod. The scene at the cottage was chaotic. The farmer, John, had a broken leg, and his wife had several deep cuts from fallen debris. While Alistair and his men worked to clear the wreckage and ensure the structure was stable, Seraphina took charge of the family. She calmly cleaned and dressed the wife's wounds, soothed the crying children, and directed others to make a makeshift splint for John's leg. She moved with a quiet efficiency and compassion that commanded respect. Alistair watched her from across the room. He saw her gentle hands tending to the injured, her calm voice reassuring the frightened children. He was seeing her, truly seeing her for the first time. She was not just a beautiful, suitable bride fulfilling a contract. She was a woman of substance, strength, and profound kindness. In her, he saw not a replacement for the woman he had lost, but a remarkable person in her own right. They worked side by side through the night. As dawn broke, the family was safe, the immediate danger over. Exhausted, they walked back to the manor together through the misty morning light. "You were admirable tonight," Alistair said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, laced with an emotion she couldn't quite place. It might have been respect. "They are our people," Seraphina replied simply. "It is our duty to care for them." She used the word "our." It was the first time she had linked them together in such a way. Alistair stopped walking and looked at her, his stormy eyes searching her face. The mask was gone. In its place was a flicker of vulnerability, a hint of the man Eleonora had written about in her diary. He didn't say anything more, but as they walked the rest of the way to the manor, the space between them felt smaller than it ever had before. A fragile truce had been forged, not with words, but with shared purpose in the heart of a storm. News of the Duchess's heroics during the storm spread through the county, finally silencing the gossip that she was nothing more than a cold London ornament. Her status as the true lady of Blackwood Manor was cemented in the hearts of the tenants and staff. The tentative peace between her and Alistair solidified into a quiet routine of mutual respect. He began to seek out her opinion on estate matters, and they even shared a few genuine, if brief, conversations about books and world events. It was not love, but it was the beginning of a partnership. This fragile new world was threatened by the arrival of an invitation to the annual Blackwood Hunt Ball, the most significant social event of the season in Northumberland. It was tradition for the Duke and Duchess to host it. For Seraphina, it meant facing society, and for Alistair, it meant opening his home and his life to the prying eyes of his peers. It also meant the return of Lady Genevieve Darlington. She arrived on the night of the ball dripping in diamonds and emeralds, her expression one of supreme confidence. She had clearly interpreted Alistair and Seraphina's quiet country life as a sign of misery and failure, and she was here to reclaim her perceived position at his side. Seraphina, elegant in a gown of deep crimson that highlighted her fiery hair, greeted her guests with a grace and poise that surprised many. She was no longer the timid bride. She was the Duchess, confident and in command of her home. Throughout the evening, Genevieve made it her mission to undermine Seraphina. She would interrupt conversations, share intimate childhood memories of Alistair, and make subtle jabs at Seraphina's family fortunes. "It must be such a relief, Your Grace," she cooed loudly at one point, "to finally be in a position where you needn't worry about turning over every shilling." Seraphina refused to take the bait, meeting each provocation with a serene smile. Her composure only seemed to infuriate Genevieve more. The moment of confrontation came halfway through the evening. Genevieve cornered a small group of influential guests, including her father, the Earl of Ashworth. With a look of feigned concern, she began her assault. "It is a tragedy, is it not?" she said, her voice carrying across the ballroom. "That for all the Duke has provided his new Duchess, she seems unable to provide him with the one thing he truly requires. It has been over a year, after all. One begins to worry if the Blackwood line will end with him." The insinuation was venomous and clear. She was suggesting Seraphina was barren. A hush fell over the guests. It was a cruel, public humiliation designed to shatter Seraphina and shame Alistair into regretting his choice. All eyes turned to Seraphina, then to the Duke, who had been standing nearby and had heard every word. Seraphina felt the colour drain from her face. This was a blow she hadn't anticipated. But before she could even think of a response, Alistair moved. He strode to her side, his presence commanding immediate silence. He didn't look at Genevieve. He looked only at Seraphina, his stormy eyes holding hers. He gently took her gloved hand in his, a gesture so public and unexpected that a collective gasp went through the room. He then turned his glacial gaze upon Genevieve and the assembled guests. "Lady Genevieve," he said, his voice dangerously calm, but ringing with absolute authority. "My wife's health and the future of my family line are matters that are of no concern to you or anyone else here. But let me be unequivocally clear. I chose my Duchess with the utmost care. Her intelligence, her compassion, and her character are beyond reproach. She is the finest woman I have ever known, and she is the only Duchess of Blackwood this house will ever have." He paused, letting his words sink in, a public declaration of loyalty that was as shocking as it was final. "If anyone," he continued, his eyes sweeping the room, "ever speaks a word against her again, they will find that they are no longer welcome in my home or in my life." He then lifted Seraphina's hand to his lips and kissed it. It was not the chaste peck of a formal greeting, but a gesture of profound respect and, unmistakably, affection. The public humiliation Genevieve had engineered had backfired spectacularly. She stood frozen, her face pale with fury and defeat. Later that night, long after the last guest had departed, Alistair came to Seraphina's chambers. He knocked softly on the door, a courtesy he had never shown before. She sat by the fire, the crimson gown pooled around her feet. He came and stood before her, his expression raw and vulnerable. "I am sorry," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "for what she said, and for everything else, for how I've treated you since the day we met." He finally told her everything. He spoke of Eleonora, of their deep love, of their shared dreams for their son. He described the agonizing pain of losing them both, a pain so immense he thought it would destroy him. "I thought if I could just shut myself off from feeling anything, I could survive," he confessed, his voice breaking. "Marrying you was meant to be a duty, a contract, to shield me from ever having to risk my heart again. It was a monstrously selfish and cruel thing to do to you." Tears streamed down Seraphina's face as she listened. "I know," she whispered. "I know about Eleonora." He looked at her, shocked. "How?" "I found her diary." He sank to his knees before her, taking both her hands in his. "Seraphina," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. "You have lived in the shadow of a ghost. You have endured my coldness and the cruelty of others with a grace I do not deserve. Tonight, when she attacked you, I realized I was not just defending my Duchess's honor. I was defending the woman I have come to admire more than anyone on this earth. The woman I am terrified of losing." His confession hung between them, fragile and precious. "I release you from our bargain," he said, his grip tightening on her hands. "I will give you an annulment, a separate estate, anything you wish. You deserve a life of warmth and happiness, not a half-life with a broken man. You are free to go." He paused, his heart in his eyes. "But God help me, I hope you will choose to stay. I hope you will give me the chance to build a real marriage with you, one not of duty but of choice." Seraphina looked at the proud, broken Duke kneeling before her, his heart finally laid bare. She saw not the end of a painful chapter, but the beginning of a true story. She squeezed his hands, her answer clear in her tear-filled eyes. "I'm not going anywhere, Alistair." The morning after the ball broke crisp and clear, a stark contrast to the emotional storm of the previous night. When Seraphina awoke, she felt a profound sense of lightness, as if a heavy cloak she hadn't realized she was wearing had finally been lifted. The air in Blackwood Manor itself seemed different, fresher, less oppressive. As she made her way downstairs, the staff, who had previously moved with guarded deference, now met her eyes with genuine warmth and admiration. They had all witnessed their Duke publicly declare his unwavering loyalty to his Duchess. The whispers were finally, truly silenced. She expected to take breakfast alone, as was their long-standing habit. Instead, she found Alistair waiting for her in the sunlit morning room, a space they had never once shared. He stood as she entered, and for the first time, he smiled at her. A small, tentative gesture, but one that held more warmth than all their previous interactions combined. "Good morning, Seraphina," he said, and the sound of her name on his lips was still a novel, wonderful thing. Their breakfast was a quiet affair, but the silence was no longer a chasm between them. It was a shared space of nascent peace. They spoke of small things, the beauty of the morning, the quality of the tea, the simple, mundane conversation of a normal husband and wife. After they had finished, Alistair hesitated for a moment before speaking. "There is somewhere I would like to take you," he said, his expression earnest. "A place you should see, if you are willing." Intrigued, she agreed. He led her not to the stables for a ride across the moors, but on foot through the manicured gardens and out towards a path that wound its way to a secluded lake she had never seen before. It was a stunningly beautiful spot, the water a perfect, still mirror reflecting the clear blue sky, surrounded by ancient weeping willows. A small, abandoned stone boathouse stood at its edge. "This was my mother's favourite place," Alistair said softly, breaking the tranquil silence. "And later, it was ours, Eleanora's and mine." Seraphina's heart clenched, but she remained silent, sensing he needed to say this to bridge the past with the present. "I haven't been here since she died," he continued, his gaze fixed on the water. "I locked it away, just like I locked away the East Wing. Just like I locked away my memories." He turned to her, his stormy eyes filled with a clarity she had never seen. "I brought you here not to dwell in the past, Seraphina, but to share it with you, so you understand the man I was, and the man I hope to become, with you. My life with Eleanora was a beautiful chapter, but it is over. I see that now. You are not the start of a new chapter. You are a completely new book, and I find myself desperate to read every page." He reached into his waistcoat and pulled out the small, silver locket she had seen him with in the library. He opened it, revealing a miniature portrait of the beautiful, dark-haired Eleanora. With a deep breath, he walked to the edge of the lake and, with a flick of his wrist, threw the locket far out into the water. It hit the surface with a tiny splash and vanished, the ripples slowly fading into stillness. It was an act of letting go, of final farewell. He was no longer shackled to his grief. He walked back to her. "The East Wing," he said decisively. "It should not remain a shrine. It should be a place of life. I would like us to reopen it. Together, we can decide its future. Perhaps a music room or a new gallery. It is your house as much as it is mine." Tears welled in Seraphina's eyes. This was more than she had ever hoped for. It was a true partnership. "I would like that very much, Alistair," she whispered. When they returned to the manor, a footman informed the Duke that a reply had arrived from the Earl of Ashworth. Alistair took the letter into his study, leaving the door open for Seraphina to follow. He had, that morning, written to Genevieve's father, formally and coldly detailing his daughter's slanderous behaviour at the ball, and informing the Earl that neither he nor his daughter were welcome at Blackwood ever again. The Earl's reply was short and filled with mortified apologies. The Darlington threat was neutralised, permanently. Alistair looked at Seraphina, his relief palpable. "It is done. No one will ever cast a shadow on you again." That evening they dined together, but this time they sat beside each other at the great table. As the meal concluded, Alistair stood and held out his hand. "Seraphina," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Will you walk with me?" He led her up the grand staircase, not to their separate wings, but to the master suite, his suite, the one he had shared with Eleanora and had slept in alone for 5 long years. He led her inside and, for the first time, closed the door on a world they were building together. Their marriage had not begun on their wedding night, but it was on this night that their new life, a life of shared hope and blossoming love, truly began. The story of Alistair and Seraphina wasn't a fairy tale that began with a magical wedding. It began in the ashes of grief and the silence of a cold, lonely manor. It was a love that didn't ignite in a fiery spark, but was kindled slowly through empathy, resilience, and the quiet courage to face the ghosts of the past. Their wedding night promise of loneliness was finally broken, replaced by a new vow, not one spoken before a priest, but one forged in shared vulnerability and the choice to heal together. They showed everyone that the most profound love stories aren't about perfect beginnings. but about two imperfect people who find a way to build a future, brick by painful, hopeful brick. What did you think of Seraphina's journey from a bride of convenience to the true heart of Blackwood Manor? Her strength and patience prove that sometimes the quietest souls have the strongest wills. If you were moved by her story, don't forget to hit the like button and share it with someone who loves a story of resilience and second chances. And make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next dramatic tale. Thank you for listening.